Okay, we've been spending this semester so far talking about HTML and CSS, which are very important aspects of web development. If you think about it though, and if you look at web pages that you probably use every day, you might wonder if there isn't something more. And of course there's something more. There's a lot of stuff going on in web development. HTML and CSS are the foundation for so many things. For example, just examine a page that you might deal with every single day, Canvas. Maybe not every day. I deal with it probably every day. This is my Canvas homepage. Oh, wait a minute. This is my Canvas homepage. I get it when I go to canvas.lorainccc.edu. Now, if you go to canvas.lorainccc.edu, you're likely to get something different. In fact, you're going to get something different because you're probably not enrolled in all these classes. And if you are enrolled, you're not the instructor of these classes. I am the instructor of these classes. So we go to the same page, yet we get different results. Why is that? Well, because we log in. We log in, we identify ourselves based on our credentials, and then we get a page that's customized just for us. And there are so many pages like that. If you go to Gmail, your Google Mail, or any other web-based email, you log in, you see your emails. You don't see my emails. If you go to Facebook, you see your friends, not my friends, and you see their posts. And what's more, if you come back later today, even your page is different than what it was earlier today. The pages that we've developed in this class, if you opened up the very first page you developed in this class, it would look exactly the same today as when you turned it in. All right? Those kinds of pages are called static pages. Static pages are pages that don't change. You say something is static, it means that it's unchanging. Now you can change it, but you have to go in manually and change it. So if you wanted your page from Lab 1 to look different, you'd have to go into the HTML code and make the changes yourself manually, and then it would be different. Pages like Facebook, like Canvas, like Google, are what are called dynamic pages. Dynamic means that it changes. All right. I go to Google right now today, and I search for HTML. I get a list of web pages. I go to this page, google.com, search $Q equals. Remember this because we're going to be using this in a minute. We get a page with a list of web pages on it. And you know what? If we came back tomorrow, this page might look a little different based on any number of different factors. Or if we Googled Italian restaurants, notice what it displays. Sereno's, which is just up the road. Olive Garden, which is by the mall. Marco's Pizza, which is somewhere else nearby. 5 best Italian restaurants in Elyria, and so on. Now, do you think if someone in New York City Googled Italian restaurants, they would get Sereno's, Olive Garden at the mall, and Marco's Pizza? No, they would not. They would get the Italian restaurants that were near to them. All right? And this also changes over time. So for example, if a new Italian restaurant opened up somewhere nearby, it might show it in the search list at some point. So pages that change without changing the HTML code are what are called dynamic. All right. And those pages are not written in HTML. And let me explain to you what I mean, because even though they are not written in HTML, they still produce HTML. Talk about websites. We have clients connected to the internet, which is often drawn as a cloud because we don't really know the details of what's going on. I mean, someone knows the details, but your average user, you don't know all the machines that your request goes through before it hits the proper server. We just call that a cloud. It's connected out there somewhere. So the client is a person running a web browser. Or it could be another program. For example, Google's program that crawls the web looking for new web pages. But for our sake, we'll talk about the client being someone running a web browser. And that could be on their phone, or that could be a desktop browser, a laptop browser, a tablet, a game console, possibly. They're connected to the internet and they make requests for a particular web page. That request gets sent through the internet until it finds the appropriate web server. Now, there are protocols and there are domain names, like there are IP addresses, all those things that you might touch on in later classes. Every computer on the internet has an IP address, which is like a numerical address. And a domain name is a name because it's easier to remember a name than the numbers. So Google.com has some numbers associated with it, but I don't know what they are. But I do remember Google.com. So it allows you to put in a name and have that get mapped to the IP address. But at any rate, that's not terribly important for our purposes. This request gets routed through the internet and it ends up at the web server. And the web server does one of two things. If the request is for a static page, that's a plain old HTML document, which might have JavaScript, it might have CSS code, might have images and other things. But those pages are simply retrieved by the server and delivered to the client as an HTML page that contains CSS, JavaScript, etc. In the case of dynamic pages, so if you went to one of your pages, if you put one of your pages out on the internet that you've done so far in this class, this would be the process. Or if you went to a very simple page on the internet, this would be the process. Now, if you went to a more complicated page, like, for example, Google, if you typed in a Google search, that request would be made and it would be sent to the server, and there would be dynamic web pages at the other end. Dynamic pages are not written in HTML. All right? They are written in maybe ASP.NET, maybe Java, maybe PHP. There's a dozen or more different technologies that they could be written in. But they all do basically the same thing. These are little mini programs or programs that get executed. The web server executes those programs, reads a database maybe, and produces an HTML, CSS, and JavaScript document to send to client. So don't worry that you wasted your time learning HTML in this class, because even if you're working in a server-side scripting environment, you're creating web pages that create HTML. So you might be writing the code that writes the HTML. So you still have to understand how HTML works in order to develop a web page. So let's follow through a typical request. As a client, you make a request for a web page. Now that request contains a bunch of information about you. It contains what your IP address is. And the server can use that IP address to find out an approximate location of you. All right. It returns whether you're working on a mobile device or what gets sent is as part of the request is an indication whether you are on a mobile device or on a desktop device or whatever. It might include data that you enter in a form. In other words, when you go to Google, how does it know you want to search what you want to search for? There's a form for you to fill out. It's a pretty simple form, but there's a form where you can type in what you want to search for, and the button go. It's a form for you to type in what you want to search for, and that's what you get searched for. So the data from the form is included in your request. So a whole bunch of data is included with you. That's what made the people that run Google rich, is they developed a good way to search the internet to find what you're looking for. So all this information gets passed as part of the request. So you go, what page do I want? And here's the information that I want to search for. In the case of Canvas, it would be, what page do you want? And here's my login credentials. That makes it to the internet, gets to the proper server, Google or Canvas or whatever. It pulls up the script, the instructions, the recipe, if you will, and accesses the database and produces an HTML page just for your request. The difference between static and dynamic pages are sort of like the difference about when you go and order pizza in the cafeteria versus if you called Pizza Hut and asked for a pizza delivery. If you go to our cafeteria and order a slice of pizza, that slice of pizza is already made, right? The pizza's already made, it's sitting there, and you ask for a slice of pepperoni, the server just grabs the slice and gives it to you. It's already made. That's like a static page. In the case of a dynamic page, like Pizza Hut, you call the restaurant and ask for a certain pizza. They build it based on your input, what you want on it, what toppings you want, what size you want, what kind of crust you want, all those decisions. If you want extra of something, all those things get factored in when they make that pizza with their recipe for making pizzas. But you know what? In both cases, you get sent a pizza. You have pizza at the end. Either it's pre-made pizza or it's pizza that was made on the fly right there for you. That is what server-side scripting is. Like the pizza that gets made specifically for your request. Now, we don't study this part of it in this class. Well, we study this part, but we don't study dynamic scripting in this class. There's other classes that cover that. CISS232, CISS243. But we do study this part of it. In other words, how I can create a form on a web page to make a request and get that data back from a web server. So that's what our focus is going to be today, and maybe a little bit next time as well, is how do I make a form to allow the user to enter data in and get data back from a web server. Okay. Let's look at this example. I have this out in the week 11 folder. I have a simple search form that I created. I coded this form. You can download it and look at the code. And we're going to look at the code. Pretty simple code. Our code, however, is connected to Google server, which is something that they allow because they want people to use their service. So they don't care if you write the search form or not. As long as you follow their rules, yeah, you can use their search service. So if I type into my form CSS, I go to Google server and see CSS. I type in JavaScript. I see JavaScript. So how do we do this? Well, we do this through what is called HTML forms. There's several tags associated with HTML forms. The first one is the form tag itself. We have the form tag, and then here we have the end form tag. Between the form tag, the start form tag, and the end form tag, there's all the information that we want to send to the server. So in this case, it's very simple. We only want to send one piece of information. Therefore, we have a text box for that information. And then we have a submit button. The submit button goes and sends the data to the server and gets the results back from the server. Notice on the form tag, we have two attributes, an action and a method. All right. The action is whatever script out on the internet is going to handle this request. In this case, we're connecting to Google and we want to use their web search. So how did I know to put this in? Well, I did a web search from Google. And I looked at the URL or web address that got called. Which is a really long thing. But I've been doing this long enough for me to know that this is a part of the URL I'm interested in. And the name of the script is the part of the URL before the question mark. Question mark indicates the data that we're sending from the form and other places. In this course right now, we're only interested in the data that we're sending in from the form. How does the data get sent in the form? It gets sent in the form by saying Q or query equals, and then we have what gets put on the form. What got put in the form. So that's what I typed in that text box, HTML color codes. So that is Q equals whatever I typed in the text box. Now let's look at my example. action is HTTPS www.google.com search. Well, I got that from this part of the URL. So the action is the name of the script that you need to call. The method is going to be either get or post. Now we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But when the method is get, it sends the data as part of the query string. What is the query string? It's everything after this question mark. So sometimes if it's not really private data, it's okay to send the data as part of the query string. Like in this case. This isn't my social security number or my user ID or password or something like that. So it's not particularly private data. So I can send that on the query string. So that's what get means. The other option is post, which we'll look for which we'll look at in the second example. Now, the next thing I have is input. Input type equals text. That's a plain old text box. Just like this. A box for you to put text in. I've given the text box a name, though. Where have we seen this Q before? We've seen it as part of the query string. Q equals the value we've typed into the text box. So we have to make sure that the name that we give to that text box matches what the script expects the data to be put in. And in this case, we did make sure that because the script is expecting Q equals something. So we make the text box have a name equals Q. So Q is the name that will be used on the query string, and that has to match what the server is expecting. If we change this to something else, guess what? Google doesn't know what to do with it. So the Google server effectively throws up its arms, says, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what ZZZ means. Therefore, I'm not going to do anything with it. However, if we change it back to match the name, which it should be, we got from the URL, then we're working again. And it works. All right. It's a text box, and it's going to send the data in a variable on the query string named Q. Now, just for laughs, if we change this to post, well, we'll have to see what happens. I have a feeling it's not going to work. And my feeling is right. Gave me an error. And it tells me that the method post is not appropriate for the search URL. That's all we know. So post is normally, or post can be an option, but not in this case. So we have to use get as our method. Now what happens if I get this wrong? I type in a wrong name for the URL. Google also doesn't know anything about it. It says that that URL doesn't exist. So if you get one of these things wrong, depending on what you get wrong, it's not going to work, but it might show you that error different ways. The submit button is sort of like Captain Picard in Star Trek saying, make it so. This says, okay, I've entered in all the data that I need to enter in. Let's go and do this thing. That thing being calling this script and passing this data as part of the query string. Let's go send all that data to the query string. Now, one thing that sometimes students misunderstand is they think just because in this example, I only have one text box, they think that there should be only one text box per form field. And if there's multiple text boxes, then you put each one of them in a form tag. That's not true. You put everything that is in a everything that you want to send to the server in sort of like an envelope. And that form tag is like the envelope. So if you want to send 3 text boxes, a drop down, and so on, then you can put all of them within one form tag. It's sort of like a package that you're getting because sometimes you want to send more than one data. The obvious example of that is if you want to log in. You want to send the user ID and the password. Another example is if you are, if you are purchasing something online and you need to put your address in, right? You need to put the city, the state, the zip code, maybe special instructions or something like that. So you might be sending more than one field of data, in which case there'd be more than one text box or other thing inside the form. Now, any questions at this point? Now, for certain things, like Google search terms, we could type anything, right? I mean, you could search on anything that you were interested in, all right? And the sky's the limit, right? There isn't a pre-written HTML page for every search. There's a recipe, there's a script that takes what you've entered in and searches through Google's databases to come up with the right answer and display those fields. But in other cases, let's say I had a form and I wanted to type in the state that I live in. Well, if it's a text box, then I can type in Ohio, right? But I could also maybe type in OH. Or if I was a fan of Ohio State, I could type in O-H-I-O. I could typo and spell it with an extra O. My finger clicks twice on the O or whatever. There are certain times when only specific values are accepted. For example, if you had state, there would be probably one of 51 options, the 50 states plus District of Columbia. That's where we get into other form controls besides text boxes. And I'm going to look at this first, and it will show you some of the things real quick. We have text boxes. We've already looked at that. We have a drop down where you can choose the type of car between a list of choices. That allows you to limit the choices to a pre-selected list of choices. We have text areas, which if you have like special instructions on your order, deliver to the front door, please knock hard. If no one answers, leave it there. Or it's more than just a single line of text. Text field, a text box is usually thought of as one piece of data, whereas a text area is multiple lines. We'll go over these in more detail, so if you think I'm rushing through it, we'll go back and look at these. I just want to show you that there's other things other than text boxes that allow you. And what you need to do is you need to decide which one of them is appropriate for the data that you're entering. For example, you have to do a pizza ordering form. Now, size of the pizza probably wouldn't belong in a text box, right? Because if the three choices are small, medium, and large, you don't want the user to type just anything in there. You want to limit them to those three choices. There's buttons, there's field sets, there's data lists. You can review these on your own. There's also a whole list of new input types. For example, there's a radio button, checkbox, a date, where you can press and get a calendar and pick the date. Some of these came about in HTML5, which pretty much everyone is using these days. All right, so my point of this section is to introduce to you that there are different form elements besides the text box. And they're suited for different purposes. If you have a field like the name, well, a name could be anything, right? So you'd use a plain old text box for that. Size of the pizza, well, size is limited to a couple of options. Therefore, you would not use a plain old text box. You would use radio buttons maybe, or drop downs. Special instructions might be longer than just a single line of data, so you'd use a text area. Is this order pickup or delivery? You could do that with a radio button, you could do that with a drop down, or you could use what's called a checkbox. So we'll look at all these in our next example, along with some other things that are there for styling of the form and accessibility. So let's look at example 2. I made the form look a little neater here. We'll spend some time looking at the CSS2. Name, email, those are plain old text boxes. Choose age range. Favorite style of music. Notice it says favorite, so you can only pick one. Favorite sport, only pick one. And do you want to be added to the mailing list? Have you read the terms and conditions? Finally, any comments that you have. I have two submit buttons. Just to show you that we can also tell which submit button gets pressed. Notice this script displays whether we press submit button 1 or submit button 2. That's very useful because we could have on a page the ability to update or delete a piece of information. If you press this button, it updates it. If you press this button, it deletes it. So we need to be able to have the script know which button got pressed, and we can do that. All right. The one that got pressed will be put with the data that gets sent to the server. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at these other form fields. And then we're going to look at the styling of them. We should be able to get through this today. If we do not, we'll come back and wrap it up next Monday. All right, I have my form. That form goes around everything that I'm sending to the server. So all these input tags are part of one form. It's like an envelope that we're sending to the server, and all the data that we want to send to it gets put in that envelope. Our method is post. So notice when I click submit, I don't see any of the data on the query string. However, that data does get passed because this is filled in with data that we've typed in or entered in. So if I type in Mike, it knows that my name is Mike. This is sort of just a test script that one of these book publishers allows people to use. One of the book authors, rather, allows people to use. And that's the script that we're going to use. So we're going to use this in this example, and you will use this on your assignment for the pizza form. That way you and I can tell if you got the names of the fields right, because you need to call the names of the fields the proper name for this to work. Or in any case, you need to call the fields what they're supposed to be called. Usually you get to make up both because usually you're writing the client and server side. If someone else is writing the server side, they'll let you know what those fields need to be named. Okay, so we have our action, that's the script that gets called, and we have our method that's going to send it part of the form request, but not visible in the query string. So we have a text box for this. Text box for this. For this, we have a drop down. And a drop down is not an input tag, but a select tag. One thing to note about these text boxes, by the way, is they have both a name and an ID. The name is needed for the server. The ID is needed for the label, which we'll get to again, either in a few minutes or next week. Select name equals, ID equals. excuse me, make your life easy and give them the same value. As part of each select tag, we have a series of option tags. The value between start and end option is what the user sees in the dropdown. The value is what gets sent to the server. So for example, if I pick my age is in this range and click submit, it sends a 4 to the server. So I saw 61 plus, the value that gets sent to the server is 4. So for as many options as you want, that's what you have. Each one of those option tags represents an option that's going to appear in the dropdown. And each one has the text that's going to be displayed in the dropdown and the value that's going to be used behind the scenes. And they're all part of a select tag. For password, we have type equals password. What that means is when we type something in, it doesn't echo back the character, it just displays a dot. And this is good because we're using the post method, and therefore no one sees it on the query screen. The script sees it, but no one sees it on the query string. I then have a list of radio buttons. Radio buttons are buttons where you can only pick one from a list of options. So they're similar to a drop-down. Typically, radio buttons are used when you have only a few options. If you have a lot of options, it's probably better to use a drop-down list. If you have a few, you can either use a drop-down or you can use radio buttons. The radio buttons are tied together through the name of the radio button. This is one case where the ID and the name is going to be different. All the radio buttons for music are called RB Music. And that's what gets sent to the server, the value of that radio button. The value equals rock. If I selected this one, it returns value equals rock. Each individual thing has its own ID though, because remember, only one thing on a page can have a given ID. Notice these three have the same name and these three have the same name. So these three work on as a unit and these three work as a unit. So by that, I mean only one can be selected. Last two things I have are the check boxes. Which is a type of checkbox. You either click it on or off. If you click it on when you submit the form, that's the value that it gets, whatever value you've put in the checkbox. You can default it by saying checked equals checked. So notice, since I want people to sign up for my mailing list, when I initially load this page, Mailing list is defaulted to yes. Where have I read the terms is defaulted to no because I want the user to deliberately click that. Now, making sure the data was entered properly, that's the job of JavaScript, which we'll talk about in a few weeks here. So this is just about the HTML, which gathers the data. Finally, comments are more than one line, so therefore I use a text area. Now, we won't get into this today, but the one thing I do want you to look at before next time, because we'll cover it in more detail, is how I've styled this. Take a look at form.css. I do want to talk about two more tags, though, before we wrap up today. One of them, or three more tags. One of them is the legend tag. And that goes with the field set. A field set groups together related fields. And you can do that for a number of reasons, for accessibility reasons and for styling reasons. So everything between here and here of the form, I've described as being personal information. And I've given that legend. And that appears up here, personal info. Well, that's a field set. A group of related fields is called a field set. And especially with larger forms, you're going to have that. So field set and legends groups fields in the form together. The last thing is we have a label. And a label is used for accessibility purposes. Because remember, people that are blind accessing your page, it's going to be very confusing to them if their cursor is in this field. What is it that they enter? Someone who can see can associate that, well, this is the name, because the name label's right next to it. What this does is this associates this label of name with the text box that has an ID of txt name. So the for label for people that use assistive technology links this label to this form field. And likewise, same thing for email, same thing for dropdown. This is the age range, therefore ID of DD age. The label is for. There will be a deduction if you don't use this, because our aim is to make websites that are accessible for everyone. So this is something you can do in the HTML that will help people that are visually impaired and that are using a screen reader. All right, because assistive technology is wonderful. However, if the page is not designed to take advantage of that assistive technology, then it's going to be difficult for the person to navigate through that site. Next time, we're going to look at the styling. We'll spend a few minutes before we get on to our next topic, looking at the styling of this form. But by all means, take a look at it. There isn't a lot of styling, and yet, with styling, we can go from a form that looks like this, actually not half bad. It's not particularly neat. But we could go from a form that looks like that to a form that looks like this. Notice how neatly these line up and how neatly everything lines up. All right, that's all I had for today. If there are any questions, either let me know now, come to my virtual office hours, which begin in roughly 10 minutes at approximately 10 o'clock. It takes me a minute to get over to the lab and to get water and come back. So I'll be there. If not, we will see you next week.